log on and sign in, and we expect to be starting any minute. We'll start just a few minutes after 3, just to give people.
And do I have to share my PowerPoint?
Yeah, as soon as we. Let me know when you're ready.
Okay. Hello?
Yes, hi, this is the NINR NS Trig call, and this is Elizabeth Cohen.
Hi, Elizabeth. This is Marion Broome.
Oh, I know. I'm so excited to have you here. We're going to give people just one more minute to sign on,
Okay.
and then I will do a little introduction, and we'll go into your presentation. We could not be more thrilled, and it could not be more timely to have Dr. Marion Broome presenting to us today, in addition to being quite an honor.
Oh,
I'm going to give people just a minute. Let's see. People are coming on pretty rapidly right now.
Okay.
So we'll give them just a minute to log on and make sure they're logged in and on mute.
Okay. How do you share it?
Go
Just
here.
right there.
Share content.
Uh-huh.
And they can't see this, so share an application.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hello. Just a quick question. I was unable to log into WebEx.
Screen.
I'm able to dial in, but not into
They have
the.
Oh, I see. I guess we've given them.
The WebEx is up, so I think if you want to log off and log back in, you can try that. Otherwise, it is recorded and archived, so you can listen today, and then you can watch the recording in just about a week to 10 days.
Okay. All right. And I'll mute myself.
Okay, that's fantastic. We could not be more thrilled. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of a welcome. On behalf of Dr. David Banks and myself, this is Elizabeth Cohen from Hunter College and Dr. David Banks from NINR. And we want to welcome you to the first NS Trig call of this year of 2020. The speaker is Dr. Marion Broome, the Dean and Ruby F. Wilson Professor of Nursing for Duke University School of Nursing, and the Vice Chancellor for Nursing Affairs at Duke, where she also holds the title of the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs for Nursing. Prior to joining Duke, Dr. Broome was a distinguished professor and the Dean of Indiana University School of Nursing and an Associate Vice President for Nursing at Indiana University Health. She's published 129 papers in 58 journals, 7 books, 21 book chapters. She's the editor of Nursing Outlook, and she'll be speaking on ethical issues in translational science. We have eagerly anticipated this topic and this call, and Dr. Broome, we thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this topic. And I have to remind everyone on the call to please mute their phones, and also that the call is being recorded.
Elizabeth, apparently you need to give us permission to share your screen so that we can upload the PowerPoint.
It's Dr. Banks who is going to give you permission to share the screen.
You can do that?
You already have the presenter permission.
Okay, and we will try to do this.
Well, it says we don't.
Says make sure you allow permission to share content, and then try again.
Yeah, you've got the permission. You want to go ahead and accept it?
Well, I don't know how we can accept it.
Okay.
Go Dr. Broome, we can see you.
No, cancel.
Yeah, you can see me, but you can't see my PowerPoint. That was the only.
Right. You have to accept the permission. I've granted you permission. Okay. I'll go ahead and take it back, and then I'll grant it to you again.
Okay, because it's not showing up.
Okay. I'm gonna grant it to you, and when I do, you'll see you are the presenter in a dialog box, and you'll have to accept that.
Okay. See, it says you're now the presenter up top.
There you are. You got it.
Okay. Well, We saw it, but we still can't.
Dr. Broome, we don't have the slides to grant your permission. Only you have the slides.
No, I understand that. We're just trying to,
Yeah, go ahead.
because I see everybody who's called in. We're just trying to figure out how to get the,
Yeah.
that switch to desktop app. No.
Okay, do you want me to take it back and give it back to you again?
Put your cursor way up there,
Yeah,
Rodney.
yeah,
If
'cause
you would, one more time. We see.
Okay, I'll do it. Okay, I'll take it. Okay, now I'm going to give it back to you. You now have it. Go up to the top left-hand corner, the third icon over says share. Do you see that?
Yeah, we've got it.
Come down on share content, the first.
Yeah, I see it, but it still says we can't display your shared content. Make sure that you are allowed permission to share content, and then try again, which is just. Yeah, is there a host code that you can give us? Because we can reclaim the host
do
role.
that. Yeah, I can assign you the host role, but I'm not going to be able to mute people if you do that. So I'll go ahead and assign you the host role.
Okay.
You now have the host role, and you should be able to share your content.
Okay.
Oh, we should have tried this before.
Yeah.
Just for everyone on the phone, please be sure to mute yourselves. Then we're all going to have to be responsible for self-muting now.
What is that red?
It's recording. That's the red dot in the upper right-hand corner.
Check applications. You've already tried that content.
I have. Yeah.
So you now have host capabilities. You're not able to share your content with host and presenter capabilities?
Doesn't seem.
Presentation to them so they can share.
Yes, send it. David, if we sent you the presentation, can you just share it?
If you give me back host privileges,
Oh,
yes.
no. Okay, we're sent.
So
no.
just highlight David Banks and right-click, and then assign me the host privilege again, and I'll be able to do that.
And send the slides, I guess.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you have them here. And then
Okay.
I am so sorry.
Not a worry in the world. We're just delighted to have you here, and we're excited for the presentation. So there's nothing. It's all good.
Well, okay, David, we just did that. Do you?
So you're the host again, David.
Yes, I am. I am now the presenter. Are you going to send the slides to me?
Jackie, will you check with her on that?
yes, she's going to send them right now.
Does she know David's email? Oh, okay. What? Yes. Oh, that sounds like a good night, David.
These are the fraternity brothers of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity at a recent dinner. It's my desktop, and it's good to know everybody can see what's going on. Once I get the email, I'll go ahead and open it up, and we can actually start with the presentation.
Wonderful.
That's fantastic. Thank you, David. Thank you, Marion. Thank you.
Oh.
This is very good, immediate problem solving. So that's all for the good.
So quick question, David. Does that mean you have to move the slides along?
Yes, I do, but I'll be listening to you and figure it out.
Okay, we'll work with that. I know you can do it. Thank you. Appreciate it. That's it. These things happen. Thank you.
No email yet.
The email hasn't come yet?
Not yet.
Well, maybe I can just start with some of the objectives of the talk, and I have about 20 slides, and I wanted to lead. This is the kind of conversation that generates a lot of questions. And and so I wanted to leave time. So I think I'll move ahead with the objectives of the talk. One thing I wanted to focus on was the range of opportunities that we all as researchers have to maintain the highest level of integrity. And in research, and by that I mean the entire continuum of research. I'll talk about...
Hang on just for 1 second, Dr. Broome. Could everyone please mute their phones? Or David, can you mute us centrally? Thank you.
I can.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Broome. Thank
you.
you.
We'll also talk about common deviations, specifically related to scientific misconduct, which is the the other end of the continuum. We'll talk a little bit about the expectations that institutions are now required to have in place to ensure that there's a climate in the institution that you can't totally prevent scientific misconduct, and I'll talk a little bit about why when I go through the presentation, but to support investigators to understand what opportunities they have to maintain research integrity. And then I want to focus just a little bit on the best mentoring for graduate students, because that's really the future, and it's absolutely critical that they learn from the best, and they learn they learn by watching, and that's how our graduate students are socialized into the nurse scientist role. And so it's important that we give voice to how we make decisions and why we make them. Nothing yet, David?
Not yet.
Well, it shouldn't take that long.
I know, it's in the sent.
It's a large file, perhaps, and it might take a bit.
Okay, well, I better keep... No, we're not good because he hasn't gotten the file yet. Okay, then I'll just talk a little bit as they're trying to get this to you. In terms of what's the definition of research integrity? And probably one of the best resources, and I'll provide some resources at the end of this talk, but the best one is the Office for Research Integrity at NIH. And over the years, NIH, I believe this research institute, office started the end of the 90s. And as I've watched them over the last 2 decades, they have really provided investigators with a lot of resources and, frankly, a lot of ability to see if you need examples of what scientific misconduct looks like and what it doesn't. You can absolutely see this on the ORI website. But research integrity is the active adherence to ethical principles and professional standards, and I'm going to come back to the professional standards in a minute, essential for the responsible practice of research. And research integrity is supported by the research team's adoption of those principles in practice. And those are directly related to intellectual honesty and personal responsibility for one's actions, professional behaviors, and maintenance of a scientific record. And all 4 of those are critically important, and all 4 are not, I don't think, things that we normally think about or talk about as we're training some of our trainees, especially things like professional behaviors, power differentials, etc., and how that can affect different members of the team, maintenance of a scientific record, and how critically important that is, and documenting all decisions that are made related to when, and it's not just what we send to IRB, there's many, many other decisions that need to be documented. So let me talk just a little bit about collegiality and professional behavior, because this has been a recent evolution in the thinking around research integrity. As you know, teams include research teams. Team science is a big focus now on these large research grants that we now are getting funded and implementing. And we usually, when we think of power and authority of the investigators, we think about that related to the participants that we're recruiting. And we certainly have to give that thought, and I think we're all very familiar with human subjects protections, et cetera. What we're not, especially those vulnerable populations of individuals by virtue of age or cognition or education, its position for student versus faculty. I think almost all nurse scientists are very familiar with those. What is not so often talked about is power and authority over two other groups. And one of those is the junior members of the team. And the other, and maybe one of the most important groups, is the group of team members who actually are responsible for implementing the study protocol. Because that is where implementing the study protocol, you're delegating your responsibilities as the PI to some members of that team. And there can be other members of your team or your behavior yourself that can be interpreted as really almost like pressure. And that can be related to analyses of data. It can be related to input of data. It can be related to collection of data. And I'll share some examples of some things related to this. And investigators really need to give this full range of the team and how important different members of the team are. David, you still didn't get it?
It has not arrived.
Jackie, please
I sent
help.
it from mine. We're sending it to the most recent email that you guys sent.
Just got it.
Good.
There we go.
That's
Okay.
great. All right. Well, we should be, thank you, Jackie. We should be on slide 3. Next one. Okay, and then this final one, what is scientific misconduct? So I do want to talk a little bit about scientific misconduct and the different dimensions or different types of misconduct that have been reported in the literature that we all see in our own institutions. And I'll talk a little bit about the different institutions that have had this experience. And so one is, and I think again, we're very familiar with these, some of these, more familiar than others, actually. The first is intentional violation of accepted procedures that have related to subject recruitment. And some of the coercion is one I think that comes to mind, but it's a withholding of information from participants that oftentimes can be pretty subtle, especially when there's competing studies in a clinic, for instance, or there are competing studies made available to inpatients or even in the outpatient setting. I always admired the way groups of HIV investigators handled this with the participants, the potential participants, but the patients that were coming into HIV clinics. The one that I'm most familiar with was at University of Alabama, Birmingham, where they would put every available protocol that was available to patients in that clinic up on a board, so they would know what the full range of potential studies that they could perhaps be eligible for were clear to them. That's pretty transparent. Now, obviously, every patient is not going to be, eligible for every trial, but in some clinic situations, there's also, not in that one in particular, but in some clinic situations, you also see that some trials pay more money, provide more incentives for potential participants. And we do know, I know this from my own work with children, that can actually sway participants in terms of weighing whether they should participate in this trial or that trial. A second area of scientific misconduct is related to project implementation. Things like double billing, control over data, and we see this without question. We see this, and maybe you don't have these issues in your own institution, but I know that we have had some of these issues here at Duke that we've had to work through, especially when PhD students begin to use data out of the EHR or the data warehouse, if you have that kind of mechanism. You will run into issues of who owns the data. Does the hospital own the data? Does a particular department own the data? Who has to be involved if there is going to be any analysis of that data? It's very interesting conversations that ensue around those issues. I think we're all familiar with data falsification and fabrication, and this, but you know, in the very blatant cases, those are easy to tell. The selective reporting is another version of falsification, and you just choose, people will choose data that supports their hypotheses or that looks better for their particular study, etc. Plagiarism's pretty, and I can tell you as an editor, this is something we're constantly, you know, looking at, and there's no hard and fast rules about that. Any academic educator actually knows that. When you put papers through, turn it in, you have some subjective judgments to make about what you're willing to accept as hijacked content or not. Authorship deviations are very, this is something that we all struggle with, ghost authorship, and in some cases, first, lead, senior author, what do all those mean? And even within a school of nursing, for instance, you'll have different people who think it's more important to be a first author or a lead author or a senior author. And if you ask people to define what they mean by those, there's not always a consistency across the school about what that means. And again, our PhD students, our DNP students are listening. They're watching and they're listening and hearing the individual opinions and trying to make decisions for themselves about that. And conflict of interest. This is becoming, as you know, if you've read, especially, I think the ones we usually think of are pharma and consultations and people's data. I'm going to give you some examples of this. But now we're also running into issues of international conflict of interest and things that we have to be concerned about. Okay, David. The prevalence, everybody wants to know what's the prevalence of scientific misconduct. I think all of us in this who are interested in this area will tell you it's anybody's guess. We do have some educated guesses. One thing that we do know is that estimates have documented increases over the past 15 years, whether those are by self-report or looking at retractions of articles in respected journals or based on surveys. And I'm going to share some of that data with you in a few minutes. But if you look at the National Science Foundation website or you look at ORI, these are reports of and investigated reports of scientific misconduct. And the numbers that I provide here show a dramatic increase. Whether this is because we're paying more attention or whether it's because we have more access now with data, whether more people look at the data, all of those probably have accounted, all those factors do account probably for the increased prevalence. On the other hand, we have a lot more education required for individuals on research teams. So one could also expect that perhaps the prevalence would go down, but we have no indication at all that prevalence is decreasing. So this is still, as Elizabeth mentioned, a very relevant topic. So we can go, okay, so I thought I'd share, and of course I'm starting out with our own institution. Any of you who've read the Chronicle saw about March this spring, Duke was featured, School of Nursing on one side, not around scientific misconduct, thank goodness, but around academic issues with international students. And on the left was the School of Medicine. Yeah, I've lost have you all lost your screen? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we lost the sentence from it there. We lost the last sentence.
See the screen, can't you?
Yep, we can see the screen, but
I don't know what happened. I have no idea. David, are you still there?
We're still here.
I'm still here, and the participants can
And
see
we
the
can
screen.
see the screen. We can see the screen and you, and we can hear
I
you.
know the password.
Oh, okay. Here we are. Can you hear me, David?
Yep.
Oh, good. Okay, because my screen went entirely blank. I was like, this is way beyond my skill set. So Aaron Potts is an actual, it's not atypical of scientific misconduct, but it was a bit unusual. So she was actually not a faculty member, not an investigator, but had a core facility here that actually ran immunoassays, lung function measurements in mice, and provided all of this data back to investigators, who in fact then went on to publish, and these were funded investigators from a variety of institutes at NIH, NSF, CDC, just all kinds of agencies. And it was not, the investigators didn't, and any of you who are investigators yourself know when you get those kind of measurements back, it would take some real, aberrations in the data for you to even raise any questions. And it actually took another laboratory scientist in the lab working with her, a research associate, who realized that her work was too perfect. And some people had raised issues before, over the 10 years that this occurred, saying that they couldn't replicate. This is why replication is so critically important. And data notebooks are so absolutely important in basic science. She wasn't, but that was not why she was fired. In 2013, she was fired because they could document embezzlement of $25,000. And it took the report of her colleague to start the investigation. These investigations go on for years, both in the institution and then at ORI. And it was just settled like I said, in March. And it cost $125 million. And the institution had to pay that back. School of Medicine, actually. So this is serious stuff. This is expensive. This is very serious. And since then, NIH has worked with Duke to put in place just many infrastructure and educational and, I don't know what your firewalls, requirements that we now have to meet, but we're very clear because we've had in external advisors that we are not the only ones. And if you look down at that did not have those infrastructures, and if you look down at the other institutions for only the past 2 years that also ended up having reports of scientific misconduct like this, at Boston U, University of Washington, UAB, Boys Town National Research, so UNC, OSU, these are all big and well-respected institutions. So this is something that every institution needs to take a very close look at, is how are they monitoring their investigations within their institution. If you look at Deepti Malhotra, this is a PhD student who actually falsified data for not only her 4 own PhD dissertation papers, but for others, and she was supported by 12 NIH grants. So, and there's a typo in institutes. So this has wide-ranging and long-term implications. We can move on to the next one. So the top retractions, and again, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but most retractions in journals are based on fabrication or falsification. But I just wanted to point out a couple of new things that happen. Not only does the paper itself that is published and retracted based on a figure and perhaps bad data, not only does that paper get affected, but then there can be other papers that included the data in a review paper. That has to be retracted. So this has huge, it doesn't even affect just the investigator themselves now, but other teams as well. And there's also been reports, and these require retraction, where investigators or peer reviewers who are reviewing papers will publish it under their own name. That's found out when duplication comes out of another journal, when COI, and there's no way reviewers can pick this up. Our reviewers are just really phenomenal individuals and give a lot of time to this, but they're really not able to pick up all of this. So these are just some examples of the top retractions that were published in the Scientist magazine that I thought were interesting. My own work back in the 2000s was funded by NINR, I believe. And we actually interviewed over 1,600 research coordinators. It was my belief then that they were closest to the action. And I was right. And interviewed them about not just, we did a survey of their attitudes and opinions and perceptions, but we also collected data on 300 of their reports of actual scientific misconduct that they had been engaged in, not engaged in, they had witnessed or been engaged in over the past year. And that particular paper was really interesting and published in Nursing Research. And there was much to be learned from that. And you can move on to the next one, David. I'll just share some of the selected results. None of this should surprise, the first three should not surprise anyone. If you've ever known anyone in your own institution who was accused of scientific misconduct, it's pretty close. In my opinion, it's, this is not somebody who has high levels of integrity about anything else either. They really are very focused in what they do. They tend to work in silos. And most of the reports of scientific misconduct will validate that. I think the last two are what we had not documented in the literature previously, but I was certainly aware of. You have investigators who are just not very involved in their studies. And when that happens, you're going to just really create a climate where people feel pressure, they pressure participants to be involved. Sometimes they make up data and enter it, and the PI has no idea because they're not paying attention. And then the other factor that became perfectly clear looking at these cases, and when I would present this at different conferences, research coordinators would tell me stories that were just amazing. In some kinds of studies, you're paid by participant, you're paid retroactively, not prospectively. So there's a lot of financial issues for the PIs related to some of these clinical trials. And the number and intensity of protocols at that time was not even something anybody thought of. And so there were research coordinators who were managing incredible workloads. And there was no way from listening to them that they could have possibly been able to focus on anything in terms of deviation from what was expected in terms of data, or they were doing everything they could to just keep the study afloat. You can go to the next slide, David. So in terms of reporting scientific misconduct, and this comes back to the professional conduct of the team as well as the power differentials. These research coordinators told us that we asked them whether the typical RC what would they do? Would they ignore it, even if they had firsthand knowledge, or would they report it? Would they go directly to the PI? What would they ask the PI to do? And you can see the numbers here. First of all, not many would report it, even if they knew about it and had observed it. But then if they did, they were very reticent, sometimes twice as reticent, to talk to the PI but not report it. Or would, in some cases, if they could go around the PI, and this is like whistleblowing, right, and go to higher authorities, they would. But we had many documented cases when they did just that, and then they either lost their job or they were harassed after that by not only the person they reported it to, but the PI. So these are, I think, just real world kind of examples that we all have to be very proactively careful about. And we have to explain to anyone on our team that we expect to see this. These are things we expect to know about. It's important to know about it. And it should be no secret that these research coordinators thought that there was much more pressure in the academic setting for scientific misconduct than there would have been in freestanding or in private practice. And that doesn't seem to have changed. Now, the other thing I'd like to point out, and we probably better move a little more quickly through these slides, on the next couple, is there was another interesting survey done. You can move to the next slide, David. Of NIH-funded scientists and postdoctoral fellows, and because traditionally ORI just focused on plagiarism, falsification, and fabrication, because those are easy to measure. Those are not opinions. They're very cut and dry and easy to measure. But if you look at the next slide, there are behaviors that I would wonder if there's any PI I've known, including myself, that hasn't seen some of this. And it depends on who your funding agency is. Usually PI is funded by NIH, assuming it's an independent, R-level grant. Changing the design, methodology, or results of study should rarely, and at least in my experience and my colleagues' experiences, does not occur unless it's based on reviewers' comments before the thing gets funded. But you have other mechanisms that the agency can be very heavily involved in looking at the data and making some changes, based on what's happening. And the PI has to be very careful about what those changes are and how those are made, and again, how they're documented. So some of these are using others' ideas without obtaining permission. I have seen that in my career. And I think, again, when you're working with trainees, it's very, very important to talk with trainees about how that is absolutely unacceptable. I know that nobody owns ideas, but the reality is, there's no harm in giving plenty of credit where credit's due. So what is scientific misconduct not? It is not honest data. And nurse scientists are particularly worried always about this, is how they're going to make an honest error. That's not what it's about. It's not about one complainant's interview, one whistleblower. These things take years. Evidence review, rebuttal by the accused, because these are very serious accusations. They have huge consequences for the individual, for the institution, as I mentioned, and they used to have very serious consequences for the whistleblowers. Now whistleblowers are not just protected, but in the way the law is written, whistleblowers can be compensated. The whistleblower in the Potts case, Aaron Potts' case, actually was compensated millions of dollars. Now, that's not why this person did it, but the reality is the protection's going way beyond just protecting your job. The consequences are severe of scientific misconduct, and they affect all of us. Not only do they affect the personal reputation of the individual who engaged in, and this is the next slide, misconduct, but also, I gave you a few examples. If you've done a systematic review and you've included a paper and then it gets retracted, well, then it can actually affect your paper being published. Also, the colleagues on the research team, they too are affected. They're part of that whole team. And when and teams usually work together over time, and they can have these retracted, and then they could be up for promotion and 3 or 4 papers just disappear through no fault of their own. The journal, several journals have, if we could go back one, just also suffered. There's an institutional reputation, institutional sanctions. All of NIH funding can be threatened, when scientific misconduct is under review, and the extent of that depends on the extent of what happened. And also, I wrote an editorial in our commentary in the Clinical Nurse Specialist Journal when we had the Scott Rubin case where he made up data on in pain, and then went on, and he had 19 papers that had to be retracted, and much of the evidence-based guidelines that were developed at that time were based on some of his related to anesthesia and post-op care were related to his data. So all of that now is threatened. And frankly, as the end result, you have many of these cases, they threaten the value of objective science to society. Lay people don't understand how this gets through review, funding, and they trust scientists. So I'm going to kind of gloss over publication ethics because I know there's probably going to be some questions. You're all familiar with authorship disputes. There's not a paper probably out of a team that doesn't have some differences of opinion about who should be first, second, third, etc. Inaccurate data reports have to be very careful. PIs need to make sure that they are looking at their data and making sure that it is exactly what is reported. Because again, until, especially in the US, we don't have access to the actual data. And even when you do, are you going to rerun this data? It usually doesn't happen just because you're doing a peer review. So publication ethics is going to continue to be, we're going to have issues around this for a long time. So let's talk about the ethical practices and dissemination of research. And these are just some things that are not only documented in the literature, but also certainly things that I tell teams that they have got to, this has got to be a constant discussion at their team meetings. What manuscripts are going out, they need to be kept in a database. They need to be reviewed every time, who's on first, who's last. You know, who's actually taking responsibility. No, you cannot have a postdoc or a pre-doc writing the paper and then being the middle author. That's not at all appropriate. Doesn't meet the accepted guidelines for dissemination and authorship. Certainly not sandwich or salami publishing. So there should be markedly different questions for each manuscript, and thereby markedly different data. People need to report intervention studies because of so much now in systematic reviews and meta-analysis. You just can't sandwich and salami out that intervention study. And on the other hand, there's no way you're going to take your average R1 and have one paper come out of it. I've heard people suggest that, and that would be way too long for most journals. And it is important if you do, multiple papers to reference the larger or parent study in each paper. And that's probably one of the most common things as editor I run across. I have an intuition about this now, and, I'll write somebody back and say, this looks pretty narrow. Is this part of a larger study? Oh, yes, it is. I'm like, well, we need to back up here a little bit. And so I think this, and we'll skip the next slide. I do have, you can have access to these decision criteria for slicing and dicing. So what is a research team to do? I know there's a lot of training. I just finished my financial compliance myself, and staying up to date on all training. And I know it's a lot, and I know education alone does not, will not prevent scientific misconduct, but it is one step, and it's a minimal step. And it needs to be made perfectly clear by every PI that this is an expectation, that everybody's going to do it and they're going to do it on time. Again, holding regular team meetings and talking about those actions that are decided. Trainees cannot read our mind, and they're not a seasoned investigator. We need to know who's been at each team meeting. So who's accountable? Who heard what we had decided to do? Keep it, not just a record of that, but that documentation of all decisions. I know some PIs that go as far as to have people sign off on the minutes after each of their particular team meetings. And I think requiring all abstracts submitted and accepted, both of those be kept in a common file, on a routine basis, probably quarterly at the very least, reviewed by the team. Data analyses must be reviewed carefully by all team members. It really takes a village to pick up some discrepancies, and they could be honest mistakes, for sure, without question. But I think we have to remember that if we have certain monitoring in place and people know what the expectations are, that does a lot to discourage any thoughts of going off and using data on your own and reporting it unethically. So what does a PI do as leader? Again, ensuring own data is up to date, knowing each individual's team members and their pressures. You have to know your team as people and know what their pressures are. And you also have to visit data collection sites to get to know those individuals. What are the challenges they're encountering? Is their workload for recruiting far too heavy? Are they running into competition that they didn't expect? Do they trust each other? Do they trust you? This is all about building a climate that will actually, again, it may not prevent scientific misconduct, but it will create a climate in which people feel safer to bring up the challenges, and will also share their concerns about other members of their team that they think are under too much pressure or making mistakes that they shouldn't be making, and that only they know about. So mentors and mentees, as academics and nurse scientists, we all train our PhD and DNP students. It's incredible, powerful modeling. We make decisions all the time about what data is going to be presented and what data is not going to be presented. Who are we going to include as authors? How much of their work do we think through with them versus them? I cannot tell you how many papers I've sent back and said to a doctoral student, you know what, you have some pretty senior people there. I'd suggest this paper is rejected, but I'd suggest before you send it anywhere else, you involve those individuals. And if they're not involved, if they're already on this paper, which of course I know if they're on or not, they need to do some work on it with you. Should not just be one person sending this in. And so data, especially in today's world, is just how we code it, how we clean it, how we analyze it, how we look at it. We can't just give it to the statistician and say, please, tell us what we do to support these hypotheses, or tell us what we need to know to answer these research questions. And finally, I've left you with, good, we have a little time for questions, but I have provided some sources of ethical support. The COPE committee is very, very helpful in terms of publication ethics. And we also have the ICMJE. I find their guidelines, which were actually just updated this past December. When you're working with colleagues in health professions, especially medicine, those are not just medical journal editors. Those are editors in all health fields, but we call them medical editors. Deciding who's an author, who's eligible to be an author or not, who it would not be an author at all, who should be acknowledged. Those are all clearly spelled out. And I find it just helps the conversation to go much easier if those are shared at a group meeting, at a team meeting before, as you're making decisions about authorship. And there's plenty of other sources on here that you can take a look at. So David, I was assuming that we would have time for questions and take some. Is that a fair assumption?
Sure.
That is a fair assumption.
Yes. So this is the part where it's always a little tough because we have to unmute everyone. So we're going to go ahead and unmute people, but please put yourself on mute if you're not asking a question. And we would welcome questions at this time from people. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions.
I'd like to ask the first question. Dr. Broome, you have seen some interesting negotiations between junior faculty and doctoral students and senior researchers Can you share any tips or advice that you would give the junior folk in trying to negotiate different issues around authorship and the manuscripts themselves? Do you have any
Yes.
advice, top 3 things they need to know?
That is a great question because, of course, it comes up all the time. Again, going back and taking the criteria that's published in the ICMJE is one strategy for the young person to have a discussion with their mentor and to get some information from their mentor. You know, how is it you read these criteria, and what do you think I can expect when I bring, you know, when I'm defending my dissertation and we ask for who wants to be involved in the final publications of the papers that we send out in a manuscript. How should I look at these criteria and just have a conversation about the criteria and what their mentor really expects and how they interpret them. But I think it's also, I have found in every faculty I've been on that this is a worthwhile discussion out of the Center for Nursing Research or out of the doctoral programs by the doctoral program coordinators is what kind of practices do people usually have related to authorship? People need to be on the same page. This is not, there's not an opinion about, and this is not something that, you know, if you look at these criteria, they're pretty black and white, frankly. You can, you have to meet so many of the criteria, and what I tell people, I'm commonly asked, well, you know, I had so-and-so was on my committee, they really didn't do anything, but they insisted on being on the paper, and now I've been asked to revise it, and so I'm going to revise it, but I really don't think they should be on the revision. So I point out that every author that went in on the first paper was expected to be on the second revision, but you can put them to work, and you can meet with them individually, and you can say, I need some help revising this part. Could you please do a draft for this, you know, addressing these comments? And then, you know, because the team has decided that we all need to write a small piece of this, and I'm happy to, you know, then pull it all together, but I really need your help here. Make them work for it. Make them work for it.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
Do others have questions for Marion Broome, who is also, as I was mentioning in the introduction, the editor of Nursing Outlook. So she's seen this from a number of different sides as an investigator and as an editor.
Liz, I have a question. This is Julianne.
Yes, of course, Julianne. Thank you.
Yeah, just if Dr. Broome would mention, or maybe she did, I don't know, at the beginning, about the issue of self-plagiarism, which is always very confusing as to what that really means.
Very good question. I'll never forget in 2006 when this first came out, Bill Holzmer and I arguing in inane about this. Because you know, it's very hard to describe a measurement tool 15 different ways. And I think what most editors, we have an organization called Inane, and there's about 120 of us, and we meet once a year. And this is a continual topic that comes up. There are parts, and I sort of did allude to this, when you get back when our manuscripts are, for most of the journals, undergo, you know, they're submitted to a plagiarism software. So before we even send it out for review, we take a look. All of us take a look at it to see. Now you can get an estimate of 10% to 30%. And so you really then have to go through the manuscript, as you know, and take a look at what parts are the same, you know, and what parts are different. And that's really where the, judgment comes in. In my opinion, in my practice, I shouldn't even say opinion, but in my practice, if I see data, or I don't get worried about measurement tools and their description that are have been published in another paper, especially if it's a paper related to this team. When I get worried is around data, discussion, hypotheses, introduction. Those are the ones where I'm like that, that tells me there's something else going on. But in your hard fact kind of descriptive work, another thing would be the sample. How many different ways are you going to describe a sample? If you're talking about one set of variables and they're the same, they're a different set of variables in this very complex study, but it was the same sample. You're going to pick up some overlap in that area. So I think every editor that I know does make some judgments about that. When I said it was, what bothers me more is when people don't cite the larger parent study, when they act like this paper is a report of something that stands alone and by itself, because that's just dishonest. I mean, frankly. And I think sometimes people, especially students and young authors, are afraid that that there'll be other questions raised if they're part of another study. But that's not true at all. It's more important, again, to give credit where credit's due and to try to understand how this particular paper fits with the larger parent study. So whether it's self-plagiarism, which is what I was speaking to in the first, but I think most editors have moved to that same way of thinking about it. And we now are actually allowing for reprints and publishers are a little looser about if it's really just a very highly relevant and unusual paper, reprinting it. Perhaps you've been asked to reprint some of your own studies in European journals or special issues. Those just have to be, again, above board. It has to be just clear. And I think it should be clear on the CV of the person. I've had several of my papers published in either European or most recently in the Journal of Professional Nursing as part of a collection of the 50th anniversary. But it was clear that this was a special collection, and on my CV, I didn't list it as a separate paper. I listed it with the original, and they just say it was reprinted in the special collection so people can find it. I think you just have to be honest about it, those kinds of things. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think the more confusing one, and maybe it doesn't apply, is review articles. Because sometimes we're asked to write many review articles. How many ways can you change a review article?
Right, you will. Well, and what you'll get is you'll see the overlap on the descriptions of the study, right? That's where you'll see a lot of overlap is as in a review paper. What I encourage people to do is put those in the chart, the actual descriptions of the studies, to focus on those in your charts and tables, because then it's expected that, and nobody's going to have put that in another table, usually. It's when you put it in the text that it will show up as repetitive. But if you're doing conceptualizing the integration of those studies differently, that shouldn't look like overlap. But it depends. If you have any questions, talk to the editor, because we each, we think about that too.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. This is great. We probably have time for one more question before we sign off. But I also want to say that the disconnected PI or the disinterested PI is a really important point, and one that I think I'm really grateful for hearing that in this presentation today, and for thinking more about how PIs can be responsible in conducting a number of different studies, especially if they're in charge of a lot of large trials. So I think that's a good point, and likely to be one that stays relevant or increases in relevancy going forward. We want to thank you for your presentation. Does anyone else have a short question that they'd like to ask?
Yes, I have one question.
Oh, go ahead. It sounds like we have two questions. Go ahead.
Well, the question I'd like to ask is really to have Dr. Broome's opinion regarding letters to the editor versus research articles. Where, if at any point, one can have both regarding one set of research data?
Oh, interesting question. I don't want any data in a letter to the editor.
That's exactly my point, that in a letter to the editor, you wouldn't have the data.
Well, we have a lot of runarounds, is what I call runarounds now. I have people sending me these commentaries all the time, and I'm like, this isn't a commentary. I just say to people, if you have a letter to the editor, you need to address the specific article that was published in Nursing Outlook. You need to, say what your critique is. I'm going to send it back to the original authors. They're going to say, what they think. And we'll publish both of those because we want to encourage dialogue and debate. But I don't want, if you're going to add data, no. Because frankly, what people are trying to do with that, I think, is kind of get around the system of peer review. They're trying to do that with commentaries too. And sorry, that's where, I think each editor will make up their own mind, but most, I believe, would say that no, data has no place in a letter to the editor. You can write a commentary and or critique and put it into a short but full manuscript. If it's that big a deal, then it deserves more than just a letter to the editor, for sure.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. I think, Dr. Broome, will you take a comment by email, questions and further comments?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Oh, that's great. We thank you so much for this
you're
presentation.
welcome.
We thank you for sharing your knowledge on this and for helping guide us. It is so genuinely appreciated.
Oh,
and
you
I will also
welcome.
follow up after this call.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, everyone.